During my 2 decades or so of working with Linux, I've picked up my fair share of tips, tricks, workarounds, hacks, convenient commands, and things like that. And in my various videos, I make sure to give you guys as much of that information as I possibly can. But what I wanted to do was create a dedicated video, that's what this is, a dedicated video on all of the tips and tricks for working with the Linux command line that I wish that I knew when I was first starting out. Now, to be fair, some of these tips and tricks might be elementary to you guys depending on your experience level, but it's my hope that at least some of these tips will actually help you out. Maybe some of them will become part of your daily workflow, and I'm really hoping that you'll find at least some of these helpful. Now, speaking of helpful, I want to give a quick shout out to Linode for sponsoring today's episode, and I couldn't be happier with them as not only a sponsor and partner of Learn Linux TV, but also as the infrastructure provider for Learn Linux TV. All of the internet-facing servers for this channel are running on Linode, and using the URL that you see on the screen right now, you can set up your very own Cloud Linux server that'll be available wherever you want to access it from, and you'll get $100 in starting credit towards your new account. Linode has all kinds of features, but not only that, they feature quite a few distributions as well, all the mainstays such as Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, and others, but they even have Arch Linux, and how cool is that? Yes, you can actually use Arch Linux to power your server. If you do it correctly, it's a rolling release, but it is something that you could do on Linode, and how many cloud providers actually give you access to Arch Linux? If nothing else, you'll be able to say, I run Arch. Definitely give Linode a try. I highly recommend their service. I couldn't be happier with it. And thank you so much to Linode for sponsoring Learn Linux TV for so long that I don't even remember. They've been a sponsor for quite a while, the first sponsor for this channel, and I'm really happy to have them on board. So let's go ahead and check out my favorite tips and tricks for working with the Linux command line. Alright, so here I am on my laptop, and I'm going to go over some of my favorite tips and tricks right now. Now, I'm going to go over these in no particular order, so just stick with me and hopefully you'll find at least some of these helpful. Maybe you'll add these to your daily workflow. That would be really cool. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, what I'm going to do is start off with a really easy one. So I'm going to go into the Etsy directory. I'm going to change directory into that directory, and now that's my current working directory. But what if I want to go back to the previous directory that I was just in? Well, to do that, I can actually type cd and then dash, and that's it. I'm just going to type cd dash just like that. I'll press enter, and I'm back to my home directory. Now, of course, you could go back to your home directory by typing cd and then tilde just like this. That does essentially the same thing. But the difference with cd dash is that it's not specific to the home directory at all. So, for example, if I go into the Etsy directory, then after that, let's just say I go into a different directory, cd dash takes me back to the previous directory, like I mentioned, whereas cd and then tilde takes you specifically to your home directory. And I'm sure a lot of people know about cd tilde, but I guess if you didn't already know that, then, well, now you do. So what I'm going to do right now is just clear my screen. So I'll type clear, and when I press enter, it's going to clear the screen. Actually, I'm not going to press enter, but I am going to clear the screen. But wait a minute, how did I do that? So if you have output on your terminal, and then you hold Control and press L, that actually clears your screen. It's that easy. And yeah, you could type clear to clear your screen, that does work. But when you do that, you're using quite a few more keys than when you just simply hold Control and press L, which I find to be the easiest way to do it. So again, you have output on the screen, just hold Control, press L, and that's it. You've cleared the screen. Now, the screen isn't actually completely clear though. So for example, if I use my mouse and I just scroll up a bit, you can see that the output that I had is still there. So essentially what Control L is going to do is just move the command prompt back to the top of the screen, giving you all the space back, but the history is actually still there if you use your mouse wheel to scroll up. Now, alternatively, you could also type reset as well. And that's actually going to reset your shell. And I'm scrolling the mouse wheel, but I'm not able to scroll. Why? Well, I reset everything. So reset is kind of like clear on steroids. It actually empties out everything and legitimately clears your screen in every sense of the word. Now for me, it's just muscle memory to hold Control and press L, so that's what I do. I don't use reset all that often unless there's something wrong with my shell session, maybe something isn't acting right. If that's the case, I might type reset, but most of the time I'll hold Control and press L, that's what I'll do. Now earlier in the video I showed you CD- to go back to the previous directory, but what I'm going to show you right now is a different way to do the same thing, but it's a little bit more flexible. What I'll do right now is change directory into the /var directory, but I'm going to go about it a different way. Instead of typing cd, I'm going to type pushd, and then the directory I want to go into, and you can see that I am now in the /var directory. And that's pretty cool. So what I'll do, just to illustrate the point, is just change directory a few more times. Now I'm in my home directory, and now I'll just go into my .config directory. So I've changed directories a few times here. It doesn't really matter which directories you change into, but what I'm going to do right now is type popd, and I'm back to Etsy. When you type pushd and then give it a directory, you'll change into that directory, but it's not quite that simple. When you change directory into the new directory, the previous directory is added to the stack. And here you can actually see the stack. I'm going into /var from /Etsy. The pushd and popd commands are actually more involved than this. There's more you can do with it. But for right now, what I recommend that you remember is how to type pushd and then popd, and pushd remembers the directory that you are in, and then popd will take you back to that directory, even if it's not the most recent directory that you are in. If you recall, CD- takes you back to the previous directory, but pushd gives you the ability to remember a specific directory, and then popd puts you back into that directory anytime you want to go back there. So if you plan on doing some file system navigation, and then at the end of that you want to return to a specific directory, that's when pushd and popd helps the most. So now I'm back into my home directory. Let's go ahead and continue and check out some more tricks. The next trick I'm not going to spend too much time on because it's one of those things that I could actually explain in greater detail, but I've already done that. I have a whole video about background tasks, so I'm going to summarize it here. But I'll leave a card right about here if you want to check out my background process video and learn even more about how this works. Now let's say, for example, I have a file open. I'm going to use Vim. For some reason, this doesn't always work with Nano. I don't know why. But it really shouldn't matter if it's a text editor or HTOP or whatever program. Basically, any program that is in the front. You know, something that takes you away from the command line. And what if you want to return to the command line, but you don't want to close the program you are in? So what I'm going to do is just open up a random file. I'm going to choose the Etsy SSH SSHD config file. And let's just say I'm in this file right here, and I'm changing some configuration options. But I need to work on something else real quick because something came up and I need to go do something else. And let's say I've made a bunch of changes to this file. I'm not ready to save the file yet because I'm not finished with it, but I also don't want to lose it either. So how do I get back to the terminal without actually saving the file and also without opening up another terminal window? Well, what we can do is hold Control and press Z, and that effectively minimizes that particular program to the background. Now, it's not quite the same thing as minimizing a program in a desktop environment or a graphical user interface, but we're going to pretend it's essentially the same thing because that's the value that I see here. You have a program running, you don't want to lose it, you don't want to lose your work, and you do want to return to it, but you also don't want to open up a terminal just to get back to the command line. This is a great way to do it. So now you know how to send things to the background. But how do you get it back? Well, that's easy. You type FG for foreground, and then it comes back. It's that simple. You hold Control Z to send something to the background, something that's in the front, and then FG, and that'll bring it back to the foreground. So I'll go ahead and exit this. And like I mentioned, it doesn't really matter if it's a text editor. Another example of this is HTOP. And this is a really cool utility for monitoring system resources. But the same thing applies here. I can hold Control and press Z. It's sent to the background. FG. It's now in the foreground. If you want to find out more about how this works, then check out the video that I mentioned. But at the very least, being able to send something to the background and then bring it back to the foreground will probably save you a lot of time. Just keep in mind that if you close the shell or log out, you will lose whatever's running in the background. So just make sure you remember that when you send something to the background, you should bring it back to the foreground, finish what you're doing before you close your terminal window. All right, so it's time to move on to the next trick, and what I'm going to do first is just update my package repository index. So I'll type apt update just like that, and I'll press enter. Oh wait, I forgot to use sudo. You know, as long as I've been using Linux, you would think that I'd remember that by now, but even after 2 decades, I'm constantly forgetting to run sudo. Of course, I could just run sudo apt update. I mean, it doesn't take that long to type that command, but that's not what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do instead is type sudo and then 2 exclamation marks just like this, and then I'll press enter. And it worked. Now check this out. When you run sudo exclamation mark, the 2 exclamation marks actually refer to the previous command that you just ran. So by running sudo exclamation mark, I'm telling the command shell to repeat the most recent command, but put sudo in front of it. So that way I don't have to worry about retyping the entire command just to run it as sudo. This is a great way to repeat the last command, but make sure that you have the proper privileges and run it with sudo. And again, I find myself forgetting to use sudo quite often, so this trick right here is something I use at least once a week. Now another trick is going back through the command history by holding Control and pressing R. Now this is kind of confusing to explain, so I think showing you will make more sense. So I'm going to hold Control, I'll press R, and now the command prompt is changed to a search field here, so what do I do here? Well, what I do is I start typing part of a command that I remember, part of any command that I would have ran in the past. Maybe I want to bring back a long command that I ran in the past, but I don't remember the syntax and I just don't want to go through the history file to find it. I'll just type what I know of the command, so we just ran apt update, for example. Now notice I just typed apt and it's already showing sudo apt update. If I hold Control and press R again, it'll go to the next thing in the search history that meets that criteria. And Control R will just keep going back through the command history. And then once I find the command that I was looking for, I rerun it by simply pressing enter. And the sudo apt install htop command, that's what I ran off camera to install htop on this computer. So there's popd, we ran that one. We also ran pushd. Any command that I've ran in the past, I could easily run it again with this trick. I'll hold Control and press C to break out of this. And what I'm going to do is show you yet another way to run previously run commands that I think is even better. What I'm going to do right now is run history, just like this. And we see all of my command history, which is very useful in and of itself. Especially if you're a new Linux administrator for a company. If you're working with a server that has a particular problem, maybe it's a problem that's happened in the past, and as a new Linux administrator, it's always a good idea to check the command history because you could find out what people before you have done in similar situations. And like I said, this is a cool trick in and of itself, but that's not actually the trick that I want to show you. What I'm going to do is show you how to rerun any command from your history. Notice that there's a number on the left side of each of these commands. So for example, I typed this command right here off camera to see whether or not htop was installed on this computer. It wasn't, so then after that, I installed it. But what if I want to run this command right here yet again? I could just right-click and copy it, and then I could right-click and paste, but that's not what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do instead is refer to the command by its number, but first I'll type an exclamation mark, and then directly after that I'll type the number, no space or anything like that. And us Linux people, we often refer to the exclamation mark as bang, so essentially I'm typing bang 102. And what happens is that it actually shows me the command that's associated with that number, and then it runs it. So right there I was editing the SSH config file, so I could do that again by typing bang and then the number, just like before, and now I'm back into that config file. I think this is a very useful way to use the history, but I'm going to make it even better. One thing that I think is missing here is the date and time. I feel like it's really helpful to have the date and time that every command was run in, so that way if I'm looking for a specific command during a specific time period, I could find it and have a better idea about the actual command history and when the commands are executed. But the problem is we don't have that information here. So how do we get it? For that, we have a very special variable, and it's hist time format. And what I'm going to do is set this equal to a very specific string. So I'm going to type %, capital Y, dash, %, lowercase m, dash, %, lowercase d, space, %, uppercase T, and then another space. And adding another space here is really important. I'll explain why in a moment. But anyway, I'll press enter. And now that we've done that, let's run the history command again. Now we have a date next to each of the commands right here. Depending on how your shell is configured, it might actually show the same date for everything because maybe a date wasn't recorded when it was first created. Different distributions set this up differently, so this may or may not be a problem for you. But at least going forward, it's going to have the correct date and time for every command. So if you're looking for a specific command from a specific time period, you could just scroll through your history, and as you can see, it shows that information here. Now, one problem with this, though, is that when you close your shell, then the hist time format variable is going to go away. We set the variable here in this session, so even if I opened up a new terminal window, it's not going to apply to that particular terminal window. It's only for this session. So what I want to do is actually make this permanent. And the way to do that is we just open up a special file with an editor. We could use nano, vim, it doesn't matter. And what we're going to do is open up the .bashrc file in our home directory. And right here we have hist control. And that's actually another trick that wasn't on my list, but it may as well have been. Hist control being set to ignore both means it's going to ignore lines that include a space at the beginning. So if you want to type a command and you don't want it to show up in the history, if this is set, you could type a space in front of the command and it won't show in the history. So if you are running a command that contains something sensitive, it might be a great way to hide that from the history. But that's not what we're here for. What I'm going to do instead is add the hist time format variable right here in the bashrc file, so that way every single shell I open will automatically have this setting. Just like that. So I'll hold Control and press O to save the file, Enter to confirm it, Control X to exit out. So from this point forward, every terminal window that I open should have the hist time format variable set, giving me the date and time for each command. Now earlier I mentioned to not forget to type the space at the end when you're setting the variable. And the reason for that is because if you don't, then there's not going to be a space in between the date and time and the command, so this space right here would not be present. Because you added a space at the end of that string, it's putting that space right here in between the date and the time and the command, so if you don't include that, things get, confusing. Now another command that I want to show you guys is completely useless. I mean, it's cool, but it gives you no practical capabilities whatsoever. It doesn't enhance your workflow, so technically, it doesn't even belong in this video, but I figured it might be fun to show you. And that command is cmatrix. You have to have this package installed. Most of the time, this will not be installed, so you could use your distribution's package manager to install this package. So I'll press enter, and you'll see immediately what it does. Does that look familiar? If you recall, in the background, I often have a laptop that has this as the screensaver. But it's not actually a screensaver, it's just a full screen terminal window that's running cmatrix. I just think it looks really cool in the background. Again, it has no practical use whatsoever. It's not going to enhance your productivity, but it's cool. Now, as an aside, what I often do is press F11 to make the terminal full screen. And that makes it look even cooler. But F11 is not actually specific to cmatrix. That's a trick in and of itself. So I'll press F11 again, and that undoes the full screen. And then to get out of cmatrix, I hold Control and press C. And now I've broken out of cmatrix. So again, I'm going to press F11, and notice that the terminal is now full screen. So F11 is a terminal shortcut, and it's recognized by quite a few desktop terminal emulators. There's some that don't understand F11, but most do. And that makes it full screen, and I mean full screen to the point that you won't see any window controls at all. You won't see your panel. It's literally taking up your entire screen. So I'll often do this if I want my terminal to basically cover up everything else, if I don't want any distractions, and I just want to work on something without seeing anything in my desktop environment. I don't want to see email alerts. I don't want to see anything but what I'm working on. I'll just press F11 and make the terminal the only thing that's visible. And when you press F11 again, it returns it back to normal. In addition, most desktop terminal emulators will allow you to increase and decrease the font, and this is something that I often do in my videos. So what I'm going to do is hold Control and Shift at the same time, and while I'm holding those down, I'll press plus. Notice that every time I press plus, the font will get larger. If I hold Control, not Control and Shift, but just Control and press minus, as you can see, the font is shrinking. Now, often when I do this, it kind of plays around with the sizing of the terminal, so I'll often press reset to make sure that it's going back to the proper size. Otherwise, I might have some blank space up here. But anyway, that's how I actually adjust the size of the font in my videos. I often crank up the font size to make sure that you guys are able to see what I'm doing. And sometimes I have to shrink the font size if something I'm doing is taking up too much space. I've had some people in my comments ask me how I do that, and if that's you, well, now you know. Now what I'm going to do is just press the up arrow a few times. I'm going to just bring up a previous command. I think this one right here is good enough. And what I'm going to do is hold Control and press U. And it just deletes everything on that line. Literally everything. And depending on your computer, it could take some time to actually backspace everything out. I mean, that didn't take too long. But if you had a complete wall of text, Control U will simply just delete everything. That's pretty cool. Now, similar to that, I'll bring up another command here, maybe something a little bit longer. I guess that's fine. Since we're on the subject of Control U to delete everything on the prompt, there's a few other shortcuts that also involve holding down Control. So what I'll do is hold Control and press A, and that puts the cursor all the way to the front of the line. And then Control E takes you to the end of the line. Now suppose that I want to run this command right here. But before I press enter, I realize that I probably should have included sudo at the beginning. Now I could hold down the left arrow, go all the way to the beginning, which might take more time if the command is even longer, and then I could type sudo and I'm fine. But what I think is more practical is that you can hold Control and press A, and that immediately brings you to the front of the line, and then Control E takes you to the end of the line. So that way I'm able to jump to the beginning, add sudo, jump back to the end. That'll save some time. Maybe not the most useful thing in the world, but you never know. Maybe this is something you'll find helpful at one point or another in the future. So I'll clear the screen. This time I'll just hold Control and press U to delete that command. And now I'm back to an empty prompt. Now what if I wanted to run two commands one after another? Maybe I want to run sudo apt update and then sudo apt dist upgrade. The first command will update my package repository index, whereas the second command that I mentioned will make sure that all available updates are installed. What I could do is run sudo apt update, and then once it's done, I can run sudo apt dist upgrade to run the second command, but that's not what I'm going to do. Instead, I'm going to set up the command just like this. And watch what happens. It immediately changed the command into the dist upgrade command, so if I was to press enter, it's going to install all of the updates. Now, of course, apt is actually specific to Debian and Ubuntu, but the command itself doesn't really matter. I'll just say no for now because I don't need to update anything. I'm just using a temporary installation on my studio laptop. I don't really care to update it right now anyway. So what I'll do right now is just chain two random commands together. So ls-l, and then I'll run echo hello world. So the first command produced this output right here because I ran ls-l, And the second command echoed hello world to the screen, which we see right here. So now what I'm going to do is show you another variation of this same idea. So I'll recall this command, and I'm going to take away the semicolon here. And instead I'll type 2 ampersands. What do you think is going to happen? Let's find out. The same thing. But wait a minute. If it does the same thing, if this method chains 2 commands together as well, then why would I want to use the semicolon versus the 2 ampersands? To demonstrate the difference, I'm going to bring back this command right here, but what I'm going to do is make the first command completely invalid. So I'm going to list the storage of a directory that doesn't exist. This will produce an error. And then I'm going to chain the command into echo hello world, just like before. But the command stopped me though. It's telling me that this directory does not exist, which I knew, but it didn't run the second command. That's interesting. Let's bring that back, take away the ampersands, and I'll replace them with a semicolon. So we get the same message as before. It's telling me that the directory does not exist, but it still ran the second command. So now you can see the difference. If you chain commands together with semicolons in between, it will actually run the next command if the previous command failed. But on the other hand, if you chain commands together with ampersands instead of the semicolon, if it encounters an error, it will not run subsequent commands. And that's the difference. Depending on what you want, maybe you want the second command to go through if the first one fails, or maybe you don't, and that'll determine which one of these you actually use. Now, another command that I want to show you guys is tail-f. And I feel like this is a command that a lot of people know already, but for whatever reason, I didn't find this out until much later in my career. So I want to make sure that I let you guys know about this as early as I can. So if you didn't already know about this, well, you're about to know about it. So what we're going to do is just tail a log file. I just chose the varlog syslog file randomly. You could give it any file that actually exists. Now when I press enter, it's going to show me the contents of varlog syslog, or at least the last portion of it. And you can't really see it now, but if anything was to happen on this system, then this is going to update in real time. So I could literally watch the log as content is being added to it. So that way, if I'm troubleshooting something, I could keep my eye on what's happening on the server. Maybe the other person that's telling me about a problem can try to reproduce the problem. And while they're doing that, I'll just watch the log. And as they're trying, I'll see new entries being added to the log file. It's a very cool thing to do. And to break out of this, you hold Control and press C, and now you're back on the command line. Now for the next trick. If I list the storage of my current working directory, I actually have this file right here called hello.txt that I actually created off camera. If I check the contents of that file, you can see that all it contains is hello world. Now we're going to pretend that this is a very long file. Maybe it's a log file, for example, and we want to empty it out. Now, most of the time, you can actually delete a log file and then the service will recreate it, but that's not always the case. It's actually easier to truncate a file, especially if it's a log file. It's a safer thing to do than outright deleting a file. Maybe there's still an open file handle to that file, and if you go ahead and delete a log file, maybe a new log file will not be created, and that wouldn't be good. So what you could do is run truncate. We could set the size, that's what the -s stands for. We'll set the size to 0. Be very careful with this, by the way. And then we'll give it a file name. And that's going to make the file size of that file exactly 0, thereby deleting everything it contains. And that's why I mentioned you should be careful with it. If I cap the contents of hello.txt one more time, it's an empty file. And that makes sense. We set the size to exactly 0. It's now an empty file. So now I'm going to show you guys one more command that I like, and that's the column command, but it's actually more useful when you chain commands into it. For example, if I run mount, it's going to show me a list of all the file systems that I have mounted on my computer, or server, or whatever it happens to be. But it's all kind of jumbled together. And yes, part of that is because of my font size, but even if I shrink the font size and then run it again, it's not all that much better. So let's try this a different way. I'm going to run mount, And then I'm going to pipe that into column -T. And I might need to make the font size really small so you can see the difference. It's going to make sure that all the output is shown in columns, which makes it a lot easier to read. And it's not specific to the mount command. Any command that produces output that's a little jumbled might actually benefit from being piped into the column command, like I'm doing here. If nothing else, piping mount into column -T is useful of and by itself, so if that's all you take away from this, then I guess that's fine too. So there you go. I hope you guys found at least some of these tricks helpful. Let me know in the comments down below if you know of any other commands that I forgot to mention here. I think it might be very helpful if we all share our favorite command line tricks in the comments. That'll be really cool. Anyway, if you like this video, please click that like button, and I'll see you again very soon. Thanks for watching.